Imaging planets is an entirely different process than taking photos of deep sky objects, such as nebulae and galaxies and star clusters. Large aperture and high focal ratio telescopes, such as the Schmidt-Cassegrain, Maksutov, or Newtonian reflectors, are best suited for this task. But I think the majority of amateur astronomers own lens-based refractor telescopes. In the previous episode of Astrophotography Japan, I described my workflow for planetary imaging using a refractor telescope and focal extender lens to boost magnification. Using focal extenders or Barlow lenses can be a bit tricky, so the protocol I described was rather detailed. Anyhow, at the same time I was collecting data for that video, I was also experimenting to determine the optimal setup and parameters for the capture of Jupiter video images. This episode of Astrophotography Japan will look at two variables, filters and image exposure settings. I took a lot of images and thought it was interesting, so I am sharing them with you, even though they are nothing spectacular. The equipment used to gather the data for this video is the same that was employed in the last episode, my SVBony SV503 80ED telescope. Here are some of the details. It is a good performing, well-built, double lens design ED glass refractor telescope. That is all I will say about it. And the Jupiter pictures that I will show were all derived from AVI format videos taken with this telescope by the ASI 585MC planetary camera and developed using the AstroSurface image processing software on a Windows platform. I find this processing software to be powerful and easy to use. Let's dive in. My first experiment was to compare images of Jupiter collected using different filters, all of which are shown here. These include a blue filter from Aquila, a IR pass filter from SVBony, a light pollution filter from Bader, and a UV IR cut filter also from SVBony. Oh, and of course, a no filter control. These just happen to be a bunch of 1¼ inch filters that I collected over the last few years for mostly visual observations of the planets. For most, I never even tried to use them in astrophotography until now. In my OTA setup, the 585MC camera I used was outfitted with a 1¼ inch nosepiece. It allowed me to attach it to the focal extender lens for collecting these images. So to use these filters, I simply screwed them in the front end of the camera nosepiece to place them in the imaging light path. Of course, every time I changed a filter, I slewed to a bright star, specifically Aldebaran, to get a precise focus with a Bahtinov mask. And interestingly, the diffraction patterns all looked a bit different for each of these filters, as you can see here. The first night that I attempted this was February 9th, under a 90% waxing gibbous moon. At this time, around 6 p.m., Jupiter was 32 degrees away from the moon and up at around 72 degrees in altitude, high in the sky, so it was easy to image from my backyard. During the winter months here in the Tokyo, Yokohama, Japan area, unfortunately the skies are usually very unstable. Seeing conditions are typically very bad, and this has a big negative effect on the resolution of planetary surface details. So don't expect too much. The sky was probably close to the worst case scenario, as you can see from this MeteoBlue web forecast application. It shows sky index predictions of 1 on a scale of 1 to 5. The arc-second visibility is another measurement that I suspect predicts the resolution possible if the air was undisturbed. But with indexes of 1, on this night, air turbulence was constant. Here are the images I took on February 9th. Each of these were processed with totally independent settings that seemed to result in the best image that I could achieve for each of these filters. They have similar recognizable patterns, but all are slightly different. Based on the image processing metadata, the typical capture rate was around 200 images per second, resulting in thousands of raw data subframes from which to choose. For all of these data, I chose to select 40% of the best frames to use in stacking to generate the images that I will share. This is me here doing some filter changes on the camera in between imaging runs where I captured 5 millisecond video images of Jupiter at a video setting of 240p, allowing very high frame rate capture. 2 nights later, on February 11th, under very similar bad seeing conditions and even worse arcsecond resolution predictions, I captured some more images, repeating this experiment again with the filters. Here, I added these to the slide as well. Coincidentally, on this night, the great red spot happened to be facing toward the sun, so this time around, it was nice to also image that famous Jupiter surface structure. A little later that night, after dinner, I tried again, and to my surprise, I happened to capture a shadow transit. That was 2 coincidences this night, the great red spot and a shadow transit. How lucky is that? At 7:15 there was no shadow, but at 8:15 to 9:15 it was easily visible as illustrated here on this Stellarium desktop application. If you did not know, the Sky and Telescope magazine website has a Jupiter's Moon prediction application where you can explore for past and future Galilean moon transits. Here, the simulation is set for the night when I did this capture, and it was exactly as I saw it. Pretty awesome. Notice it was the shadow of Ganymede that started its transit around 7:30 p.m. and lasted to 10:08 p.m. here in Japan. Interestingly, before that, the moon itself transited about the time that I was capturing the prior images earlier that night, but unfortunately the image resolution was not sufficient to be able to see the moon in front of the planet Jupiter. From all these image data, my opinion is that the UV-IR cut filter provides the best results in terms of contrast and clarity. Let me know in the comments if you agree with me or have other experiences or suggestions. The other parameters that I have wondered about and tested during these nights in February were related to exposure. In a previous video I published, episode 27, I speculated on the ideal video image capture time for Jupiter being around 60 to 90 seconds based on magnification, camera pixel size, and rotation rate of the planet. But to be honest, I was rather relieved to see when Dylan O'Donnell suggested a very similar time recently on his YouTube channel of Star Stuff. I was speculating. He is an expert. Anyhow, on February 14th, Happy Valentine's Day, I did some more imaging of Jupiter in my backyard. And again, the seeing conditions were crap, perhaps even worse than before. Using my 3x focal extender lens and 5 millisecond exposure times and a 240p video capture setting, I took a series of images at various gain settings that you are seeing here using my ASI 585 color planetary camera. I varied the gain from 300 up to 450 and took 60-second exposures. While doing this, I was performing a screen capture video on my Samsung SmartPad to illustrate my point. Shown on this slide are the images that I developed by applying the exact same processing settings to each video, with the exception being slight adjustments to the brightness to get them all somewhat normalized. Again, I admit, the images are not very good, but I think the data is still relevant. On this night of February 14th, coincidentally, there was another shadow transit again. What are the chances? You can see from the Sky and Telescope website, this time it was an Io moon transit that I captured in 2 sets between 7:37 and 8:02 p.m. Here are those images again, the last one being out of sequence in time, but at a very high gain setting of 450, so I think it is relevant to include it. Below it are images from the video I recorded, with these being random screenshot capture images from my Samsung SmartPad that was controlling the ASI Air and camera. The relevant detail, of course, is the visual brightness of Jupiter that was evident on the SmartPad screen. Keep in mind that the brightness on the screen is actually a function of not just the gain setting, but also of the millisecond exposure time. So don't pay too much attention to the actual numbers. It's the relative visual brightness impact that I am exploring in this experiment. In my opinion, on the top row of processed images, I really don't see much difference except for the dimmest and the brightest outliers. In each of these two cases, I either had to turn up or turn down the gain or brightness or other settings in the Astrosurface processing software, which resulted in a little bit of photo bleaching effect at the center of the image. But from the gain settings 325 up to 400, the processed images really look pretty much the same. So it appears that the tolerance of the Astrosurface software involved for interpretation and processing of the video images is pretty high. It seems that as long as the gain capture setting is not overly dim or overly bright, the planetary image data is within an optimal range for good image development. As you may know, on the ASI Air menu, there is a real-time histogram measurement function that you can see here on this video capture screen. At first I thought this function could be useful in this assessment, but depending on your focal length and screen capture setting and other factors, these quantitative values vary substantially. So I elected not to include this confusing data. It is the subjective visual brightness on your SmartPad screen that is the relevant consideration. I almost completed this video with the data I presented here, but on March 9th, the skies cleared again and there was another opportunity to image the Great Red Spot and a moon shadow transit at about 9 p.m. But since Jupiter was somewhat low in the sky at that time, I had to go to Kawawfuji Park to do the imaging. After a great polar alignment, I captured several 60-second video images at the highest possible frame rates I could achieve on my ASI 585MC color camera. But more about that in a moment. Here are several of those images, including one where the moon Io was even visible with a little extra gain applied to bring it out. The Shallowsky website, like Sky and Telescope, also has a Galilean Moon transit simulation, and this one also predicts the Great Red Spot location simultaneously. Also, like Sky and Telescope, there is an animation which is kind of fun to observe. From it, you can see that Io has a very tight orbit close to Jupiter, moves very fast, and transits more frequently than all of the other Galilean moons. Because of its tight orbit and moon size, the shadow appears smaller as well. Here is a close-up of the animation image at 9 p.m. And this is my image taken at 9 p.m. The moon and shadow location looks pretty accurate, but the position of the red spot is not quite aligned. By the way, compared to the filter and exposure data results I showed earlier, these Io shadow images on March 9th were taken under slightly different video capture settings. Here I decided to push the camera to its absolute limit by assigning an exposure time of 1 millisecond in the camera menu. That is the fastest possible rate setting. Previously I used 5 milliseconds. At the highest digital zoom of 240p, the resulting frame rate was 16,661 frames per minute, or about 278 frames per second. In Astrosurface, to process this image, I sectioned off 40% of the best frames and stacked those 6,743 subframes. You probably remember this prior image from February 11th. If you look at the metadata, you can see that I used a 5 millisecond setting in the video menu. With that setting, I captured 10,741 frames of video data during the 60-second duration, That is about 179 frames per second. So with the same duration and the same 240p field of view capture, a 1 millisecond rate versus a 5 millisecond rate gives me about 60% more frames per second. That is obviously not 5x more frames as one would expect just based on the math, but only 1.6x more, presumably due to some inherent limitations in data capture or transfer or image processing of the hardware or software. The purpose of this explanation is not to compare the images. They were taken on different days under different sky conditions, so you can't. The purpose was to show the frame rate limit of the ASI Air and the ASI 585MC camera combination, and to stress that the single most important factor in planetary image equality, in my experience, is beyond our control. It's seeing conditions. Of course, higher frame rates, smaller pixels, altitude in the sky, and other factors and equipment are necessary considerations for maximizing the potential, but despite all of that, seeing conditions trump everything. And in the last few minutes of this video, let me show you an example of that. Oh, also notice the size of the moon shadows. The Io moon shadow on the left image is much smaller than the Ganymede moon shadow on the right image. Up until now, I have been using this linear image capture setup with my refractor telescope. But about a year ago, I published this rather popular video using the SVBony MK105 Maxitoff telescope for planetary imaging. In that video, I used this flip mirror design as a convenient way to center the planet in the field of view prior to video image capture. It worked great and is very convenient to use with high focal length telescopes. But I actually didn't think this flip mirror accessory would work with a refractor and a focal extender lens. But nevertheless, I tried it. This is the setup. Notice the positioning, the focal extender, and the filter in this OTA accessory arrangement. For your information, by research I learned that a focal extender lens can indeed work in this configuration in the front of the mirror diagonal, but a Barlow lens will not. It is something about the optical design of the Barlow that necessitates that it be directly in front of an eyepiece, but a focal extender can be located further upstream in the optical light path. Here's my actual setup using the Beta Morpheus 12.5mm wide field eyepiece, and with the mirror flipped down into the light path. With a focal tube setting at around 65mm, Jupiter and its 4 Galilean moons came into view. And here is the scope again, with the mirror flipped up out of the light path. And I was able to capture images of Jupiter with my ASI 585MC color camera. It required a little bit of focus adjustment down to around 64mm, but it worked like a charm. The Explorer Scientific focal extender performed well, being upstream of the diagonal. It provided another convenient option for imaging and viewing the night sky with this refractor telescope. And by the way, this is the actual flip mirror unit that I bought on AliExpress, in case you are interested. Despite its reasonable price, the quality of the mirror seems to be quite good, in my opinion. The views were as good as any I have seen with other more expensive diagonals that I also own. Notice here at this time, when I was looking at and imaging Jupiter, it had dropped pretty low in the sky. In fact, it was down at about 32 degrees altitude at this time. But nevertheless, I took a few more 60-second video image captures at 240p and 1 millisecond exposure times. Interestingly, compared to the data I collected previously 40 minutes before, in these new images, the clarity and contrast was much improved. Surprisingly, here at 9:40 p.m., Jupiter was lower in the sky over the mountains, and clouds had started to roll in, and the wind slightly picked up. It felt to me like the sky conditions had changed quite a bit in just those 40 minutes. Apparently, it now provided me a chance to capture more clear video data of the planet and its great red spot. I assure you this difference is not due to post-processing. I spent a few hours trying to improve the earlier images, but they could never match the ones taken at 9:40 p.m. And this is what I meant by seeing conditions are the most critical factor. But unfortunately, seeing conditions are completely beyond our control. For fun, I next swung my telescope high in the sky toward the moon, which fully filled the field of view of my eyepiece, similar to that shown here on the Stellarium application, theoretically covering 0.57 degrees of sky from edge to edge. With this flip mirror and this OTA, actually, I was astonished by the clarity and beauty of the lunar view. And these pictures of my telescope OTA look pretty cool as well. I did a video capture which at 1080p covered this section of the lunar landscape. And here is that processed image from Astrosurface software. So this night, and the others, were just experimentation with my equipment to explore its capabilities. I don't consider myself a good planetary imager. My equipment is insufficient. I know these photos aren't particularly good, but I think the exploration and data were worth sharing to give you some insights on what is possible and how to maximize your results if you want to try your luck on imaging the planets with a refractor telescope and supplemental lenses. This night, on March 9th, at Kawawfuji Park, there happened to be a couple of families that came up to the hilltop because they saw my red lights. Of course, I gladly gave them a free tutorial on astrophotography and even let a young high school 11th grader use my SmartPad to operate the imaging system. It is always a pleasure for me to share my hobby and experience with anyone who is curious enough to listen. That includes local people like them here and international friends like you. Thanks for tuning in to Astrophotography Japan. I hope you consider subscribing. I am JPAstroGuy in Yokohama. My name is Paul Cheesegel, and I want to wish you clear skies and free time to enjoy it.